I'll go easy on you, honey. Somebody's got to show these boots what a real throw looks like on a live body. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Jace Holloway, 27 years old, and it carried across the martial arts schoolhouse gym the way voices do when their owners have never once doubted an audience. 20 Marines knelt in a ring around the center mat, morning light falling in long bars from the high windows, and every one of them laughed because he was the instructor, and the instructor was funny, and because the woman he was talking to looked like the least dangerous person any of them had ever seen. The gym was the base's cathedral of controlled violence, a hangar-high ceiling, championship banners going back 40 years, the smell of sweat and mat cleaner and old canvas, racks of pads and rubber training rifles along the south wall, and a center mat the size of a helicopter pad, worn pale at its heart, where 3 generations of Marines had learned what the ground does to the unprepared. Everything in the building announced its purpose. Everything except her. She stood at the edge of the mat in a plain blue top with a clipboard in her hands and a visitor badge clipped at her collar. Mid-40s. Quiet shoes. She had been there for 50 minutes and had spoken to nobody, and she wrote things down in small, even letters, and Holloway had decided, somewhere between the second evolution and the third, that she was a prop the morning had provided for him. "I'm here to observe," she said. "You're observing great," Holloway said. "Now you're going to participate." He took the clipboard out of her hands, took it, the way you take a toy from a child, and passed it to a student in the front row. Then he stepped back, spread his arms, and beckoned her onto his mat with both hands, playing it wide for the room. Corporal Tobin Rusk, 22, had his phone up and filming before she took her first step. The schoolhouse kept a social feed. Holloway was most of it. The woman set her pen in her pocket. She walked onto the mat like a person crossing a kitchen. What happened next took under 2 seconds. Holloway closed, took a grip on her sleeve and collar, turned his hips, and put her on the mat with a great deal more speed than the demonstration required, because the demonstration was not the point. The point was the sound a body makes and the laugh that follows it. 20 Marines heard a body hit the mat. Only one man in the room heard what kind of body it was. She had tucked her chin before her feet left the floor. Her arm came around and slapped the mat flat at the exact angle they spend 3 weeks teaching, and most Marines never truly own. And her hips rolled through the line of the throw and spent its force along the length of her, so that what looked like a woman being flattened was, to an educated eye, a fall being conducted. The slap cracked like a rifle shot. Textbook. Better than textbook. Textbook is what the book aspires to. She came up without using her hands. She stood, adjusted her sleeve where his grip had turned it, and said nothing at all. "See?" Holloway took a bow toward the ring of students. "Safety lady's fine. That, gentleman, is why we breakful." The laughter came again, easy and loud. Rusk panned the phone across it. The woman crossed to the front row, and a private first class named Noah Quist, 19 years old, the only student not laughing, got up on reflex and returned her clipboard with both hands, the way you hand back something that belongs to somebody. "Thank you," she said. She clicked her pen. She wrote down the time. By the equipment cage at the gym's north wall stood Ernie Calloway, 61, retired Master Gunnery Sergeant of Marines, with a spray bottle in one hand and a rag in the other, and he had not moved for a full 10 seconds. 30 years on active duty, 11 of them, one way or another, around mats exactly like this one. Ernie Calloway had watched more bodies hit that floor than any man on the base, and he had just watched a middle-aged civilian auditor take a full-speed hip throw from an instructor trainer and land it cleaner than the instructor trainer could. He looked at her shoes, flat, quiet, sold for movement. He looked at her hands, calm at her sides, no rings, a watch worn on the inside of the wrist, and he was old enough to remember exactly which kind of people wore their watches turned in, and why, and what it had to do with light discipline on nights nobody in this gym had been alive for. He looked at her face and found nothing there to look at. Nothing at all. The gym was Calloway's in every way that mattered short of paper. He had come to it the year he retired because a man who has spent 30 years inside an institution does not learn to sleep outside its fence line in a single summer, and the schoolhouse had needed somebody to keep the floor, mend the pads, run the cage, and remember things. He swept it at 5 each morning before the first class. He knew its every dead light and every soft spot in the subfloor near the south anchor. 9 instructors had come and gone through it on his watch. He had liked most of them, tolerated the rest, and buried his opinions the way old senior enlisted men do, in plain sight, behind his eyes. She had been thrown by better men on worse floors. She wrote down the time. Holloway called the next evolution. The morning resumed its noise, its rotations, its cheerful violence. The woman stood at the mat's edge in her blue top and watched with her pen moving, and if being laughed at by 20 men had cost her anything, the price did not reach her face. Calloway set down the spray bottle. He picked up his stool, carried it to the corner of the cage, and set it back down where he could see her hands. The second hour ran drills in pairs, and the woman watched them the way nobody watches anything. Not the way visitors watch. Visitors watch the biggest man, the loudest collision. She watched entries. She watched the 6 inches between a student's elbow and his own ribs. When Holloway walked the line correcting grips, her pen moved. When he skipped a correction, her pen moved further. Quist rotated out of a drill, breathing hard, and found himself standing near her. He was 19 and polite, and his curiosity got the better of his caution. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're auditing?" "Curriculum drift." She said it without looking up from the clipboard. "Your hip throw entry is being taught 11 degrees shallower than the 2012 standard. At demonstration speed, it costs nothing." Her pen stopped. At full kit weight, it costs knees. Quist blinked. 11 degrees. 11 degrees. He went back to the line, and he entered his next throw, the way his body had just been quietly told to, and it came out smoother than it had all morning, and he did not fully understand why. Calloway drifted over at the water break with a paper cone of water he did not offer to anyone else. She took it with a nod of thanks. "You audit a lot of programs, ma'am?" he said. "Enough." "That fall pattern." He said it mildly, eyes on the mat, 2 maintenance men discussing weather. "The one they teach where you learned it. They still call it the courtyard roll?" A beat. She looked at him for the first time. Actually looked. The flat calm opening for half a second onto something with depth behind it. The way still water in a quarry is not the same as still water in a glass. "They don't call it anything," she said. "They just do it." Ernie Calloway had spent 30 years learning to read hands and shoes and the eyes of quiet people. He had just been told, without one word out of place, to stop reading. He nodded slowly, said, "Yes, ma'am," to a civilian auditor for reasons he could not have explained to anybody, and walked back to his cage. On the mat, Holloway demonstrated a mount escape with his weight, lazy, and his elbow drifting wide, because he was strong enough that the sloppiness had never once been charged to his account. The woman's pen stopped. She watched his elbow, not his hips. Students watch the flash of a technique. Instructors watch its price. There is a third way of watching, above both, that weighs the man teaching it, and that was hers. and it settled on Holloway like a measurement he could feel without seeing. In the second row, Rusk had his phone low and was replaying the morning's best moment in slow motion for two grinning friends. The safety lady, airborne. He watched it twice for the laugh. The third time he frowned. Bro, look at her arm. He spread the frame with 2 fingers. She slapped before she hit. Like, before. He showed Holloway at the rotation break. Holloway watched the woman fall in slow motion, watched her arm arrive at the mat a quarter second ahead of her body like a paid professional advance man, and something in his stomach shifted its footing, and he did not let it climb to his face. Pilates, he said, and handed the phone back. At the front counter, Calloway turned the visitor log around with 1 finger and read it properly this time. A. Voss, Curriculum Review. And on the sponsor line, where a schoolhouse visit is signed by a training officer, a captain, on a bad day, a major. The Operations Directorate of the Marine Expeditionary Force, the 3-star headquarters. Somebody at the G3 had personally sponsored a curriculum auditor into a gym. Calloway closed the log carefully, the way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping. In 30 years, he had signed 10,000 visitor logs and read none of them twice. He read this one twice. A curriculum review is a lieutenant's errand. A curriculum review sponsored in ink by the Operations Directorate of a 3-star headquarters is not a review at all. It is a headquarters looking at something through a person, and the person it had chosen to look through was standing at the edge of the center mat, being called the safety lady by a staff sergeant with his chest out. He looked across the gym at the woman in the blue top, standing exactly where she had been standing for 2 hours, absorbing a room that thought it was absorbing her. He picked up the landline handset. He held it a moment. He put it back down. Not yet. By the 3rd hour, she had a nickname, because a room run by a comedian will always produce one. Safety lady's going to write us all up, Holloway announced between drills, strolling the mat's edge with his chest out. Smile for the clipboard, gentlemen. 20 men smiled for the clipboard. Somebody hummed a siren. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and the joke had a full head of steam, and the woman it rode on checked her watch and wrote. Nothing in her face moved. In 30 years of gyms, Calloway had seen that particular stillness exactly twice before, and both of those people had been quiet, gray, unremarkable men whom other, harder men treated with enormous care. The first had taught him fieldcraft in 1989 and never raised his voice in 2 years. The second he had met exactly once, in a plywood room in another country, and remembered chiefly by how carefully a room full of hard men had chosen their words around him. Stillness like that is not the absence of something, he had learned. It is the presence of something, wearing quiet clothes. The nickname did its rounds. A lance corporal near the cage tried out, "Ma'am, the inspector," and got his laugh. Somebody asked her, mock solemn, whether hydration breaks were regulation length. A wit in the second row wondered aloud if she graded on a curve. Each sally got its snicker and turned away unanswered, and each unanswered snicker cost the room something none of them could see leaving. She checked her watch, inside of the wrist, 1 glance, no more, and wrote in the small, even letters, and the pen never hurried. And somehow the not hurrying was the loudest thing on the floor. Rusk brought the phone to her at the water break, because content does not film itself. Ma'am. Ma'am. He crouched into frame beside her like a red carpet correspondent. Rate the staff sergeant's technique for the viewers. She looked into the lens with the expression of a woman reading a bus schedule. 3rd throw was countable, she said. First 2 weren't. The room hooted. At her, at the wonderful nonsense of it, the safety lady grading throws. Rusk got his laugh and took the phone away. Only Holloway's smile came in a half-second late and left a half-second early, because countable is not civilian vocabulary. Countable is what a judge's table says. Some small sentry posted deep in the back of his mind, stood up, looked around, and was told by the rest of him to sit back down. Quist didn't laugh. He leaned to the man beside him and said, "Lo, we're filming a civilian getting dogged out. How's that end, well?" Rusk heard it and shoved his shoulder, friendly and not. "She's a tourist boot. Tourists love it." Quist looked over at the woman, and the woman, without seeming to see him at all, gave him one fractional shake of the head. "Don't. Not on my account." It cost her nothing, and it read like an order, and he obeyed it without noticing that he had. The itch got to Holloway before the hour did. Her calm was arithmetic he couldn't make come out even. Laughter he understood. Offense he understood. A woman thrown to a mat in front of 20 men should produce one or the other, and she kept producing neither, and it had begun to feel, he could not have said this out loud, like the quietest possible kind of contempt. He crossed to her at the mat's edge and stood too close, using the 6 inches of height and the 40 pounds the way he had used them his whole life. "You got somewhere better to be, honey?" His voice was for the room, but his eyes weren't. "'Cause you keep writing like my gym's got problems." "Your gym has 3. She turned the clipboard face down against her hip, unhurried, and stood looking up at him. And her feet, which nobody in the room but one man watched, had quietly bracketed into a stance that would have let her put Holloway's body wherever she chose to send it. She did not step back. Water does not step back from a man who wades into it. It just gets deep. Calloway arrived the way old NCOs arrive, out of nowhere, already talking. "Staff Sergeant, give me a hand with the cage bolts." And when he had walked Holloway 10 feet with a hand near his elbow, quietly, out of the room's hearing. "Son, leave that one alone." Master guns. Holloway's grin came back, indulgent. Retired men in gyms were furniture with opinions, with respect. She's a GS nothing with a clipboard. "I've seen that kind of quiet before," Calloway said. "Twice. I'm asking you to hear me." "Noted," Holloway said, in the voice young men use to file things in the trash, and he rolled his shoulders and walked back onto his mat, decided. If you have ever watched a room full of strong young men, decide that a quiet woman was the joke. Stay with this one, and subscribe to the veteran vault, because rooms like this one always get taught. It stopped being funny at 1100, although only 3 people in the building knew the exact minute. Holloway ran the choke station last, because the choke station was his encore. He took Private First Class Quist up in front of the class to demonstrate a rear blood choke. Depth of grip, angle of the forearm, the mechanics of unconsciousness explained with the relish of a man who has never been on the receiving end of anything in his life. He was showing off the depth. There was no tap monitor assigned. The students were watching Holloway's face because his face was where the show lived, and so nobody was watching Quist's, which had passed through red into a color with no place in a training room. The woman's pen stopped mid-word. She watched Quist's hand, down at his side, tapping Holloway's thigh. She watched the taps slow. She watched them stop. She crossed the mat without permission, and her voice arrived ahead of her, and it was not loud, and it went through the gym like a blade goes through a rope. Release. His hand stopped tapping 4 seconds ago. Holloway released, startled into it. Obedience outrunning pride by pure reflex. Quist folded. She was already there, 1 knee down, 2 fingers at his jaw, turning him to his side with an economy of motion that had nothing civilian in it anywhere. A pen light appeared out of her pocket. She lifted each eyelid, tracked the light, glanced once at her watch, timing his recovery against a standard she carried in her head. "He's postictal, not embarrassed," she said, to nobody and to everybody. "Sit him against the wall, feet flat. 90 seconds, and he'll know his name again." Two students moved on the word sit like it had come over a radio. Quist came back into himself against the wall, gray and blinking, alive to a debt he could not yet count. She stayed down on one knee beside him for the full 90 seconds, 2 fingers resting at his wrist, her eyes on her watch, while the class stood in a loose and useless ring around them. When his count came back where she wanted it, she stood, returned the penlight to her pocket, and stepped off the mat to exactly where she had been standing before. The same square foot of floor, as though the intervention had been a parenthesis, and the sentence of her mourning now simply resumed. It was the going back that unsettled the students most, though not one of them could have said why. People who act in emergencies want the moment afterward. She had handed the moment back like a tool she was done with, and the gym stood in silence around the shape of what had just happened, which was this. The safety lady had overruled the schoolhouse's best instructor in front of his own class and been right. And the being right was the unforgivable part. Holloway's ears went red. 27 years old, and every eye he had trained to watch him was watching him, and the only exit his pride could find was volume. Okay, audit's over. He came across the mat. You don't touch my students. You don't coach on my mat. Whatever box you came to check, consider it checked. Then monitor your chokes, she said. He took her arm. It was a grip, not a guide, his hand wrapping her upper arm to steer her off the mat like a bouncer walking out a drunk, and the gym went so quiet that the fluorescent hum in the lights became audible. She looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at him. She did not pull away. She did not tense. Every man in that room understood, without one of them knowing how, that the hand on her arm was being permitted, the way a fence permits weather. For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. Rusk lowered his phone. It was the first time all morning it had felt heavy. At the north wall, Ernie Calloway was no longer watching. He was at the counter with the visitor log open and the landline out of its cradle, dialing the sponsor number printed beside her name, with the unhurried speed of a man who has finally stopped hoping he is wrong. The line clicked. A voice answered with a designator, not a greeting. A duty officer at a headquarters that does not say its name to strangers. Calloway kept his back to the gym, and his voice at the level of the equipment fans. This is the schoolhouse, he said. I think you'd better tell the general his auditor's been made a training aide. The voice on the line asked him to say the name on the badge. Voss, Calloway said. Victor. Oscar. Sierra. Sierra. He heard a keyboard. He heard the duty officer stop typing. He heard very clearly a chair move, and a hand cover a receiver imperfectly, and a name spoken away from the mouthpiece into some other room. And then a different voice came on the line, older, with the flat, sanded calm that only lives one place in a headquarters. Say again the name. Voss, Calloway said. The silence that followed had furniture in it. Calloway had stood at attention in a few silences like it, decades ago, and his back straightened now on old instinct, alone at a counter, holding a telephone. Master Guns, the older voice, level. Is she injured? No, sir. Has anyone put hands on her? Calloway looked across the gym. Holloway had let go of her arm to make a point to the class about interference with instruction. The point involved gestures. The woman stood exactly where he had gripped her, sleeve creased, watching him with the bus schedule face. Once, Calloway said, she allowed it. A breath came down the line that was not quite a laugh and had no comfort in it anywhere. Do not let anyone else touch her, the voice said. Someone is coming. The line went dead. Calloway set the handset down the way you set down something that might still be live, and stood a moment with his hand on it, an old man at a counter with his heart going quicker than the morning called for. Then he crossed the floor once more, because 30 years of leading Marines will not let a man watch one walk off a cliff without a second attempt, and this time there was no softness left anywhere in it. "Staff Sergeant," he put himself between Holloway and the woman and let his voice carry, flat, all business. "Walk away from her. That is the only free advice you get today." The class went still. Holloway looked down at the retired man with the rag hanging out of his pocket and laughed for the room because he had to do something with the moment. "Master Guns, you moonlighting as her bodyguard now?" The students laughed. The laugh was thinner than it had been at 9 o'clock. Laughter has a nose for weather. Across the base, in buildings the students had never entered, the morning had already changed shape. A duty officer walked fast down a corridor with a phone against his chest, past a wall of framed commanders going back 60 years, and did not knock at the door he had been told never to open without knocking. A name went through the cracked door into a briefing that stopped mid-sentence. Inside, an aide leaned to a staff colonel. The staff colonel read the note twice, stood, and crossed to the head of the table, which is a thing staff colonels do not do at that headquarters, in that room, during that briefing. He said, "From the schoolhouse, sir, the gym," and 4 other words, and watched a lieutenant general of Marines, 57 years old, 35 years of service, a man with 2 wars and 9,000 people in his charge, rise from the briefing table without excusing himself. At the same hour, on the far side of the world, in a place none of them could see, a helicopter with 4 souls aboard was still flying, and its arithmetic had already begun, quietly, to go wrong. In the gym, the joke was still funny. 4 buildings away, it had already stopped being one. Against the wall, recovered, Quist worked up his nerve at the water break and thanked her. Quietly. Sideways. The way you thank someone the room has decided is radioactive. "Ma'am, where'd you learn the eye thing? The pen light?" She looked at him, and for a moment something that was almost warmth crossed the flat calm, the way light crosses deep water, without disturbing it. "Same place I learned to fall," she said. Holloway clapped his hands once across the gym and announced the final evolution of the morning, full-speed throws, and his eyes came around the room and settled on the woman in the blue top, with an expression his students mistook for humor. "And since our auditor loves the mat so much," he said, "maybe she'll give us one more demonstration before she writes us up." What the staff sergeant in the pressed instructor's shirt did not know was what the next 10 minutes would cost him, or who, at that exact moment, was already moving toward that gym at a speed no one on the base had ever seen him move. Subscribe so you do not miss the moment the doors open. Helmand Province, 2009. Night. The roof of the compound was packed mud, still bleeding the day's heat, and Captain Adrienne Voss, 27 years old, lay flat against it while the parapet above her head came apart a chip at a time. The night was green in her optic and violent everywhere else. Below, in the courtyard, the raid element she commanded was folding back toward the wall by pairs, exactly as briefed, exactly as rehearsed, and the plan was holding together the way plans do, visibly, loudly, and only just. Sergeant Felix Amaro was not folding back with them, because Sergeant Felix Amaro was on the roof beside her, with a round through his chest. He was 24. He was her radio operator, and he was the funniest man in the task force. And he had a wife named for a flower and 11 weeks left on the deployment. And the ladder they had climbed to the roof was 6 feet of splinters in the courtyard below, and he weighed 209 pounds in kit, and he was drowning in himself with his eyes open, looking at her. 8 months he had walked at her shoulder with the radio. 8 months of him narrating bad food, bad roads, and bad luck into comedy on the worst nights the task force had, because he had figured out early what every good radio operator figures out, that the net takes its temperature from the voice on it, and the voice on it took its temperature from him. She had written his name into 3 commendations. She had eaten dinner with his wife once, at a base steakhouse before the deployment, and the 2 women had laughed at him in stereo while he grinned into his glass, entirely content. All of that lay on a mud roof now, going out of the world through a hole she could cover with her palm. The extract window was 4 minutes. The nearest cover for a litter team was a courtyard away. The math did not work. She did the math twice in the whole seconds she had, and it did not work twice. So her hands did something her mind never planned. She got Amaro to the low side of the roof, where the courtyard wall shouldered up to meet it. She took a grip she had never been taught. Collar with one hand, belt with the other. A stance stolen from a throw that existed for putting men down. And she used her hips the way the mat had taught her at Quantico years before, and she did not put him down. She put him over. 209 pounds of marine, pivoted across her body, and thrown, controlled over the courtyard wall into the reaching arms of 2 Marines on the far side. And then she followed him over the wall into darkness and broke his landing and hers with the length of her own body on the hardpan, chin tucked, arm flat, the fall conducted, the way it always would be afterward, every time, forever. The whole net had gone quiet around her call sign that night. She would learn that later, in the debrief, that when Tempest came up on the radio calling the throw, calling the catch, calling the extract, some quality in the voice had stilled the traffic on a net full of professionals in the middle of a fight. The words stuck to her after that. Words do when they fit. On the floor of the extract bird, under her hands, under the pressure she was leaning into his chest, Felix Amaro looked up at her with the last of the great good humor that had carried a task force through a bad year and said, "Ma'am, you threw me." He laughed. It cost him most of what he had left, and he spent it anyway, because that was the whole man. He was gone before the wheels touched. The Silver Star recommendation was drafted within the week. The colonel who signed it, an operations officer named Roy Stennard, a lean, quiet man who read the witness statements twice and then sat alone with them for a while at a plywood desk with the generator thudding through the wall, put a note in the margin in his own handwriting, which was not procedure. 4 witness statements described the throw. All 4 had needed a diagram. The colonel had studied the diagram longer than the statements, because he had spent his whole career being told what was possible on a rooftop under fire, and the diagram disagreed with most of it. The ceremony was scheduled and postponed, scheduled again and overtaken by operations, and never rescheduled, because the war did not pause for ceremonies, and Captain Voss never once asked. The medal reached her in a padded envelope in a mailroom. She never wore it. 3 years later, at a martial arts schoolhouse on a base she had never visited, 2 instructor trainers building the advanced curriculum pulled a technique out of an after-action report that had circulated quietly for years in the raid community. A collar and belt carry throw for moving a casualty over a vertical obstacle when the ladder is gone and the window is closing. The report attributed it only to a raid force officer. The names were classified. They tested it, standardized it, and wrote it into the program of instruction, where it acquired the name the community had already given it. The wall carry. Page 41. For 14 years, boys had been graded on the throw she invented the night Felix Amaro died. And on the morning, one of them used it to embarrass her in front of 20 Marines. She wrote down the time and said nothing, because the technique had never belonged to her anyway. It belonged to a laughing man with 11 weeks left, and she was only its custodian, and custodians do not explain themselves to children. Her 27-year-old hands slapped the mud from her sleeves on a dark hardpan in Helmand. Her 44-year-old hand smoothed the blue top at the edge of a sunlit mat. Neither pair had ever once shaken. Holloway set the demonstration up the way showmen set up finales. Pads dragged clear, students circled tight, Rusk's phone up and steadied on the cage netting for the wide shot. He extended his hand to the woman in the blue top with a courtesy so exaggerated it curdled into its opposite. "One more for the cameras, honey." His voice found the cold open line again, because cruelty is unimaginative. "I'll go easy. Promise." She looked at his offered hand. She looked, briefly, once, across the gym at Callaway, and what passed between them was not a request for rescue, because it contained something closer to an apology. Then she set her clipboard down on the floor, squared it neatly with the mat's edge, and stepped on. She could have ended him between the handshake and the grip. The room would spend weeks afterward not knowing that. The 3 people in the building who could see it would spend weeks knowing nothing else. Instead, she gave him her sleeve. Gave it, the way you give a child the last move in a game he has already lost, and stood quiet in his grip while he played to the lens. "Staff Sergeant," Quist's voice from the circle, thin but out loud. "Don't." "Breathe, Quist," Holloway said, and threw her. It was harder than the morning's throw. Everyone heard the difference. There was anger in the speed of it, the accumulated arithmetic of a morning that had refused to come out even, the correction at the choke station, the retired man's warnings, the bus schedule face, all of it spent down through his hips into one instant of full-speed contempt. And it was, in the narrowest technical sense, the best throw Jace Holloway had ever executed in his life. She rotated in the air, chin tucked, arm flat. The slap arrived a quarter second before her body, the advance man clearing the road, and the force of the best throw of Jace Holloway's life ran down the length of her and drained into the mat. Conducted, spent, dismissed. The gym did not laugh. She came up without her hands, the way she had at 9 o'clock. But this time 20 Marines watched her do it in total silence, because somewhere between 9 o'clock and now, the room had lost its certainty about what it was looking at. And for 1/2 second, as she rose before the stillness closed back over it, her eyes were not an auditor's eyes. Something looked out through them at Staff Sergeant Jace Holloway that had been to places he trained to imitate, and it measured him, and it filed him, and it was gone. He saw it. He did not understand what he saw. His body understood. The small sentry in the back of his mind stood all the way up and started shouting. And Jace Holloway did what he had done with every warning of his charmed and undefeated life. He covered it with a laugh. "That's a wrap on curriculum review, gentlemen." Nobody clapped. Rusk took the phone down off the cage netting and did not check the footage. The circle of students had the shifting, sober quiet of men at the scene of something they cannot name. A morning that had run on laughter for 3 hours discovered it had no second fuel. Quist looked at the woman straightening her sleeve on the center mat, and then at Holloway's back, and understood with a 19-year-old's sudden, vertiginous clarity that he had spent the morning on the wrong side of something, and that everyone around him had too, and that the bill had not yet been presented. The joke was dead in the air, and everyone stood around its body. At the north wall, Ernie Calloway was already moving. He crossed the gym floor with his jaw set, done with advice, an old master gunnery sergeant going to do something with his own hands at last, and stopped. Through the long glass panel of the gym's front doors, out across the parking apron, a base sedan came off the road too fast, slewed into the fire lane at an angle no aide would ever park at, and its doors came open before the vehicle had entirely stopped moving. Ernie Calloway had been on active duty for 30 years. He had seen generals angry, generals grieving, generals under fire. He had never once seen a lieutenant general run. The doors of the gym banged open hard enough to hit the wall stops. "Voss," The name cracked across the gym like a round going off. Lieutenant General Roy Stennard came through the doorway at a dead run. 57 years old, service uniform, 3 silver stars in a row on each shoulder, 2 aides pounding through behind him. And he was scanning the room, the way men scan rooms in his other life. Fast, sectored. And he found her at the center mat, and was already moving to her before anyone else in the building had finished processing the shape of the morning coming apart. Students froze mid-drill, mid-word, mid-breath. A 19-year-old near the cage dropped a foam pad. Holloway turned with the wreckage of a smirk still on his face, the reflex of a man who greets all events as audiences, and the smirk died halfway when the stars registered. 3. Moving fast. At his gym. His brain reached for a reason. A 3-star sprints into a schoolhouse and found only file errors. "Colonel Voss!" Stennard pulled up in front of the woman in the blue top, and he did not lower his voice, because the message had outrun courtesy 4 buildings ago. "We've got a bird down in the task force you're taking. Crew's alive, wrong side of a ridge, weather closing. The recovery cell is holding a secure line for Tempest, and I am not running that playbook without its author. My car. Now. Colonel. Voss. Tempest." 3 words, and the woman in the blue top stopped existing. The room did not gasp. Rooms like that one don't. It did something older. It came to its feet. Calloway was first, braced at attention beside the cage with his heels together and his thumbs on his seams, 61 years old, and standing like the flag was going by. Then Quist. Then the whole schoolhouse in a wave, 20 Marines rising off their knees and locking upright, because the body knows what to do around the word, Colonel, even while the mind is still rereading the morning. Rusk snapped to attention with his phone still recording in his hand. The frame tilted against his chest and filmed the ceiling, which was, in its way, the most honest shot he got all day. One of the aides was already at the doors, holding one open with his whole arm, the way you hold a door for weather. The other had a handset out of its case, and left before the general finished closing the distance. Nobody in the room had ever seen a secure line brought to a person before. It changes a room's understanding of the person. And Staff Sergeant Jace Holloway stood on his own mat and went through it in front of everyone, in order, each stage arriving with the terrible punctuality of surf. Confusion. A colonel. The safety lady was a colonel of Marines. Disbelief. Tempest. He knew the word. Every instructor in that building knew the word. It lived in the lineage notes of the advanced curriculum, in the community stories, on page 41 of the manual he taught from. The wall carry. A raid force officer, name classified. He had graded students on that throw for 4 years. Recognition, arriving like ice water. The fall. The slap that came early. 3rd throw was countable. She gave me her sleeve. And then the last stage, as his eyes went helplessly to the mat between them, the place he had thrown her, twice for laughs, on camera, and came up to find Lieutenant General Roy Stennard following his gaze with a flat, sanded calm. Horror. "Staff Sergeant." The general's voice was very quiet now, which was worse. He took in the mat, the circled students, the crease Holloway's grip had left in her sleeve. "Why is my incoming task force commander on your floor?" Holloway's mouth opened. Nothing in his training, which was extensive, covered this. She did not make him answer. Colonel Adrienne Voss, 44 years old, Silver Star, 14 days from command, bent and picked up her clipboard, squared the pages, and held it out to Private First Class Noah Quist. "Third finding's yours, Marine," she said. "You'll see it when you're an instructor." Then she took the secure handset from the general's aide, and the last the schoolhouse saw of its auditor was the woman in the blue top walking fast for the doors between 3 stars and 2 aides, already talking, Grid references, weather windows, the crew's fuel state. Her voice level and quick and unmistakably in command. A voice with Annette's whole silence somewhere in its history. At the threshold, she stopped. One beat. She looked back at Holloway, alone in the middle of his mat. "Your entry's 11 degrees shallow," she said quietly. "Fix it before I'm back." The doors swung shut. 20 Marines stood at attention in a gym that suddenly had too much air in it, and nobody gave them the order to move, and for a long time, nobody moved. Holloway stared at the mat where he had thrown her, and the mat, which had told him the truth twice that morning at the top of its voice, said nothing further. The reckoning arrived the same afternoon, and it was not loud either. The schoolhouse director's office held 4 people. The director, Calloway, Holloway at attention in front of the desk, and Rusk's phone lying face up on the blotter between them, like evidence at an inquest. Its morning's footage deleted one clip at a time under Calloway's personal supervision. Not to hide what had happened, the director said, but because no video existed of Colonel Voss that she had consented to, and the schoolhouse had embarrassed itself sufficiently for one calendar day. The words, "relieved of instructor duty pending review," were said out loud. The words, "conduct unbecoming an instructor," were said out loud. Holloway stood through it with his eyes locked on the wall, 27 years old, undefeated no longer, listening to a career fold in the space of 11 sentences. Calloway asked the director's leave to say one thing. He got it. 30 years I've kept this floor." The old man's voice was even. "You're the first man I ever watched throw his own career onto it. Twice." Word of the relief went up the chain the way such word does, and it reached the operations center that evening, in hour 9 of the recovery, where Colonel Adrienne Voss stood over a map table with a headset around her neck and 2 nations' weather between her and 4 living Marines on the wrong side of a ridge. The schoolhouse director was put through to inform her of the action, it being her incident, her arm, her creased sleeve. She listened. On the far wall, a clock counted a fuel state. "Suspend it. Don't end it." She said it without taking her eyes off the map. He's just a boy who's never been thrown by life yet. A pause, and the director would say afterward that he could hear something almost like warmth in it, the way light crosses deep water. "When I'm done here, he gets thrown properly, by the standard, on the record. And then he gets rebuilt. That's what schoolhouses are for." She handed the phone back to an aide and returned to the war. Honor the ones who carry it quietly. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this story find the next room that needs it. The recovery ran 31 hours. Twice the weather tried to close the window. Twice the plan had a page for it. Once, at hour 19, a voice on the net rose toward panic over a route gone bad, and a colonel's voice came down over it, level, quick, oddly calming, the sound of arithmetic being done out loud by somebody who had done it before under worse light, and rerouted 4 living men around a ridge with 90 seconds of talking. The net went quiet around her voice. Nets had done that before. It ran, all 31 hours of it, on a playbook written years earlier by an officer who had once moved a dying man over a wall with her hips and her grip, and had never stopped thinking about vertical obstacles since. Routes, ridge lines, weather gates, the cold arithmetic of windows, every page of it built to make the math come out even for somebody else, the way it had refused to come out even for her. On the far side of the world, in the gray hour before a closing front, a helicopter crew of 4 came over a ridge on foot into the arms of a recovery force that was exactly where the playbook said it would be, exactly when. All 4 came home. Lieutenant General Roy Stennard watched the last confirmation come off the net from the back of the operations center and said, to nobody in particular, in the tone of a man settling an old account with himself, 14 years I owed her a ceremony, She never once asked. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, the martial arts schoolhouse gym aboard the base held 20 Marines, 1 retired master gunnery sergeant, and a colonel. She came in uniform this time. The Silver Star ribbon sat in its place on her chest, small and blue and outranking everything around it, and 20 students who had laughed at a safety lady stood in a silent ring around the center mat and watched Colonel Adrienne Voss, call sign Tempest, step onto their floor to teach. The demonstration required a partner to hold the mat position. Staff Sergeant Jace Holloway, suspended, retained, rebuilt one graded evolution at a time, a student again in a schoolhouse he had once owned, stepped forward and took it. He took her weight correctly. He monitored correctly. He had fixed his entry, all 11 degrees of it, and she noted it with one small nod that he would keep somewhere private for the rest of his service. This technique, she said to the class, her hands moving through the grip, collar, belt, the stance stolen from a throw that existed for putting men down and repurposed forever for lifting one up, has a name nobody wrote down. Page 41 calls it the wall carry. It belongs to Sergeant Felix Amaro, United States Marine Corps. You will say his name before you drill it. 20 voices said the name. Quist drilled first. His entry was perfect, the full 11 degrees of it, and when he finished the carry and set his partner down on the far side of the training wall, he stood a moment, with his hand still closed on the memory of the grip, the way you do when a thing you have practiced suddenly becomes a thing you understand. She saw it happen. Instructors live for the moment the technique stops being homework and becomes inheritance, and she watched it arrive in a 19-year-old on a Tuesday morning and wrote nothing down at all. By the equipment cage, Ernie Calloway leaned on the counter he had kept for years, beside the visitor log, beneath a small new frame on the wall behind the glass, a clipboard page, 3 findings in small, even letters, the third one circled. Monitor your chokes. He watched the colonel conduct a fall and the class carry a dead man's name across the morning air, and for the first time in the story, the old man smiled. The doors eased shut on the sound of it. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.